pleased to have on Secrets of Statecraft a real-life spy. Sir Richard Dearlove was the Chief of Operations of MI6 from 1996 to 1999 and was Chief of the Service from 1999 to 2004. Sir Richard, you joined SIS, which we might call MI6 for the purposes of this interview because it's better known by that name, in 1966. At a time when there was a dark shadow over the service, because, of course, it was recovering from the penetration, the Soviet penetration of Kim Philby and George Blake and others. What was it like? What was the sense of the service like at that time?
Well, when I joined, I think one wasn't, as a new recruit, particularly conscious of what was going on in terms of the service's penetration. I think that what one has to recall is that there was quite a lot of need to know. There was quite a lot of, as it were, forbidden areas for discussion. So I guess I was part of a group which was taken in, I suppose the phrase one would use now, that we were entirely clean, we were unblamed, we were uncontaminated. And it was really quite a long time after my training that one began to have a better understanding of these dimensions. I mean, that may sound terribly naive, but in fact, part of joining as a very young officer was, to keep us away from that contamination.
And there were sort of two different camps, weren't there? In that one set of people believed that it was an existential thing that SIS was going to take decades to get over. One might see James Jesus Angleton, the CIA operative, who very much thought that SIS was profoundly compromised and would be for a very long time. What you've called the nihilists. And then there was another set of people, wasn't there, who one might group around Harold Shergold, a SIS senior figure who thought the opposite. He very much thought that those penetrative agents, Philby and Blake and so on, and the time was ripe for really rebuilding the service. Is that a fair appreciation of it?
Yeah, I think that's it's been written about pretty extensively, and there's a very good book, which is a great title, Wilderness of Mirrors, about that whole period. And I mean, in fact, the high priests of counterintelligence, and that's the way I would describe Angleton, had a huge amount of influence. And because of what one or two Soviet defectors had said in that period, they had massively exaggerated. And I mean, the Angleton sort of theory was that every Western service was thoroughly penetrated, and that there wasn't really much point in believing that, we could even the equation and penetrate the Soviet services, the Warsaw Pact services, to the same degree. So, I mean, there was a very, very nihilistic group, which was represented in most of the major Western services, particularly in the US and to an extent in the UK. But on the other hand, there were those who took a radically different view and were already actually working successfully and positively in making the sort of counterbalancing penetrations of the Soviet, of the KGB in particular, and then other Warsaw Pact services.
And what did you find when you were a young operative in Prague in 1973? What was the what was the sense then?
What had happened really was that after I was trained, I actually went into work in counterintelligence, and specifically on Warsaw Pact services and particularly the Czech services. And then I was posted to Prague specifically to run a really important case, which has now been quite extensively documented because the Czechoslovak STP archives have been released. And certainly in Prague, the case has been extensively written about. I think there's a TV program being made about it. And what had happened, I mean, before my time, he had offered his services to the West. And one of the key Czechoslovak officers in the STB, who was actually responsible for operations against the UK, against the British intelligence and security community, had been recruited and was run over a period of time. I mean, there are certain bits of that case which are not in the public domain, which I don't want to put into the public domain. But I mean, the Czech end of the case and their investigations. I mean, what we know now, and I've been shown the archive files in the STB archives in Prague, is that the subsequent investigation turned that whole service completely upside down. It went on for 12 years, the investigation, because they hadn't a clue how long he'd worked for the West and how much he'd actually seen. It was an important case, and I think now it's getting its just attention historically.
With regard to the history of SIS, you've said that there are huge holes in the history, in particular the 1920s, 1945, and the early 1960s. Why is that? What's the reason for these sort of gaps in the history?
Well, there were various hiatuses historically, I think, when weeding wasn't done with any care and attention, when there were sort of physical moves of the archives, more space was required. I think there were a variety of different reasons. There were certainly groups of officers who believed that none of this material should ever historically be available, and therefore destroyed lots of documentation. And of course, there are one or two classic cases, like, for example, at the beginning of World War II, some of the Polish intelligence archives were brought to the UK. And I mean, this has been a bone of contention between the UK and Poland. In fact, at some point during the war, after the end of the war, they were completely destroyed. And the Poles absolutely cannot accept that their own archives were weeded and destroyed and haven't survived.
It's not very easy for any historian to accept it. I mean, that's a terrible thing to have done, isn't it, Richard?
Well, of course it is. And I mean, I'm not making any, I'm just saying it's a fact. It happened. Lots of weird things happened around World War II, particularly with intelligence archives. For example, I'll give you another example. The French Security Service archives were captured by the Nazis in Paris and were taken back to Berlin, and then were captured by the Russians in Berlin and taken to Moscow. And we knew well that the KGB actually had the BST archives, and they used them and they worked on them right up, into the 1960s. And it was a really terrible problem for the French because their complete archive, and it's still there somewhere in Moscow, God knows where it is.
Fascinating. Tell us about the what's called the Lord Chancellor's blanket, the process of neither confirming nor denying anything when it comes to SIS matters. Is that something that you support, that you think is useful? Do you think it's got a future?
Yeah, I mean, what effectively it is that the archives of SIS are not released in line with other government departments. So they're excluded. I mean, for example, security service documents are selectively released under the 30-year rule, although, if you're familiar with security service archives, MI5 archives, you'll see, the stuff which is blacked out. But generally speaking, they're quite extensive releases. This doesn't apply to the archives of MI6 or SIS. And I guess the reason it doesn't is that those who worked as espionage agents or agents of the United Kingdom are given a guarantee, a lifelong guarantee of anonymity beyond the grave, so that, you know, their families and their relatives' families are not, as it were, ever compromised by what might have been done by preceding generations. And actually, I think, I mean, I was originally a historian briefly, and then became an intelligence officer. I can see why this is deeply frustrating for historians. But on the other hand, I think it's entirely understandable. And I mean, the fact that neither confirm nor deny has then remained the primary policy in regard to disclosure, the official policy of MI6, I think, has been successful. I mean, I'm talking about things now, you know, to you, which are historically on the record and disclosed for a variety of reasons. I'm confirming materials already in the public domain. However, you know, I would not be disclosing to you now material that isn't.
No, absolutely. But there was a moment, wasn't there, until fairly recently, I think it was the 1990s, when the whole existence of MI6 was something that no government minister would confirm or deny, or indeed wasn't, or they denied it, in fact, didn't they, that it even existed.
It's not actually called, it's called a vowel. I mean, the technical word is a vowel and a non-avowal. And what in fact happened in the past was that it was a nice convenience for the ministers of Her Majesty's government to be able, in response to a parliamentary question, to say it is not the custom of Her Majesty's government to comment on such matters. In that the existence of MI6 had never been legally, formally acknowledged. Of course, everybody knew the service existed. It was founded in 1909, for God's sake. But it was only after the Intelligence Services Act of, I think, I'm trying to remember the date. I only have seen the moment. It was 1994, I think.
Yeah, I think so too.
Where the existence of the service was formally acknowledged by statute, and therefore it was formally avowed, and the consequences of that now are there's, you know, an oversight committee in Parliament, and the name of the chief when he's appointed is announced publicly in Parliament. But I mean, those arrangements are relatively new. I mean, when I joined in '66, it was a rather wonderful fiction that, you know, you belonged to an organisation that didn't exist, and I mean, I think that had a certain convenience, and you know, it worked well. But I think in a modern democracy, there was pressure both from within the service and to an extent without, that the service should be put on the statutory basis. But of course, it's made life much more complex legally to have the service on a statutory basis. And I mean, for example, I won't go into detail. There are many, many more lawyers in MI6 than there used to be.
Oh, that's always a bad sign. You mentioned in 1902 the foundation of the service in 1909.
Nine, yeah.
In 1909, of course, that was in part as a response to the spy stories that William Lequex and others had written. Um, and I'd like to ask about this aspect of the sort of fictional figure, this fictional spy for British intelligence, because he's quite an important figure, isn't he? James Bond being the classic and best known, I think. What effect does the fictional side of spying have, if any, on the genuine side?
I think it has quite a significant effect in some ways. I think the essence of it is it projects the myth of British intelligence as opposed to the actuality. But the myth is important in terms of one's global reputation in, let's say, attracting would-be spies or agents. I mean, the irony about the founding of the service is that Lequex, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce his name, but I think it is correctly pronounced Lequex, wrote a series of pretty ghastly thrillers which were based around the concept of, German invasion of the United Kingdom or of England from East Anglia, and basically brushed up a lot of excitement and activity about German spies. And I think there was even publicity for one of his books, when people walked around Regent Street in German army uniforms, handing out flyers for the book. I mean, it really was taken to quite a strong degree. And there was a lot of alarm in Parliament raised by, this sort of scaremongering, which was fictional but influential. And actually, it's because of that scaremongering, if you look at the historical record, that MI6 was started in 1909. It had been a section of specifically naval intelligence before that, and then it was formalized into a separate organization. So its origins are tied up, strangely, with a certain amount of fiction. And since then, you have a whole succession of spy books, Le Carré probably being the most prominent recently, certainly the Bond franchise. And all of these elements have contributed towards the myth of the service and its reputation. There's no more powerful global brand which keeps being regenerated or rejuvenated than Bond. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary the way that it's captured the public imagination. And although it, in fact, has virtually nothing to do with the reality of the service's existence, it's still probably an important influence in one way or another.
You've said of Le Carré, John Cornwall as he was, that he was the literary expression, or at least his books were the literary expression of the counterintelligence nihilists, the people who essentially argued that there was no moral difference between the KGB and MI6, that we were fatally compromised. And generally, he put a very negative, from a tremendously short period of time in MI6 himself. He, of course, made a lifetime's career out of writing about it, but at the same time, you have stated, and you got into a bit of a spat with him, I remember, a couple of years ago at the Clifton Literary Festival and afterwards, over his portrayal of MI6. I wonder if you'd like to sort of relive that a bit and tell us what you meant by this concept of the literary expression of the counterintelligent nihilists.
I'm not going to criticize Le Carré as a writer. I think some of his books are really very good and very gripping. And, he is an outstanding novelist of his time. The vehicle, for his reputation is entirely MI6. And he writes about it in this way, which, because of the success of his novels, has sort of been quite authoritative. But of course, you have to remember it's fiction. And he was in the service, of course, briefly, and then in the security service. And he claimed before his death, that he was completely disillusioned because I think he said he was blamed by Philby, and that prevented him having a constructive and exciting career. I find that hard to accept because lots of officers get blown early on in their careers for one reason or another, but it's still quite possible to have, a successful career. I was identified as a British intelligence officer as a result of the case that you mentioned in Czechoslovakia. It didn't stop me having a successful career after that. So I don't accept Le Carré's analysis of the way his career didn't take off. But on the other hand, if you read his books about the circus, they are all about betrayal. They are all about penetration by Russian/East Germans. They are about, the failure of the West. I mean, he's really taking that nihilist theme and juxtaposing, Carla and Smiley fighting, this battle, which the West, I would say, probably in his books is usually coming off worst. And he paints a very, very corrosive picture. I mean, my career largely was based on the concept of trust, not betrayal. Of course, if you're working in a trust environment, when a betrayal happens, it's that much more punishing, and the feelings of personal letdown can be extreme. But I mean, the Carré's books are a make-believe world, where everybody is a villain and not to be trusted, except one or two. I mean, Smiley. Well, even Smiley doesn't come out of it particularly well. So if you're not looking at these books purely as literary works, but you're looking at them from a professional angle, I'm very critical indeed. And you well know that when I said this about Le Carré or John Cornwall, as he was in reality, I mean, he took a gin and was very cross with me. But I mean, we had previously met, but we hadn't discussed this in quite that detail. And it took me quite a long time to reach this conclusion about his books. One's views form over time. But I certainly wrote a piece about this which was put in the Telegraph alongside the obituary. I don't know whether you wrote this obituary, but somebody.
No, I didn't. I actually wrote an article a bit like yours, pointing out that he was a corrosive influence, as you say.
Yeah.
The You've been critical of the biography of MI6 by Kevin Jeffries, but you've been positive about the novels of Alan Judd. Um, I agree with you here again. I think Alan's novels are great, but then I was never a spy, so I don't know how accurate he was, whereas he and you were. What do you rate? What do you rate? Why do you rate Alan Judd's book so highly?
Well, I think Alan's books have a real. They haven't. They somehow capture an essence of what modern espionage, sort of as the Cold War ends, is really like. And there's something quite authentic about them. They're cleverly written. And all I'm saying is that if people want to read fiction and get a sense of what it might be like, they're going to get a more accurate picture from reading Alan. They're also well written, entertaining, and clever books. And I think he's just struck a note which nobody else has managed to. I mean, I won't go into the explanation of how he's done it.
No, fair enough.
They're good, but I mean, Keith Jeffries' book is a courageous book to have written, but essentially, it's an institutional history of MI6. It describes the place of MI6 in government, and it's really almost a sort of departmental history. It's not an operational history. I mean, there are some bits in it which are operational, but I mean, the fact is, Keith Jeffries wasn't really given the access which would have allowed him to write an operational history, and in a way to preserve the neither confirm nor deny, which we've already discussed. It was correct that he shouldn't. But I mean, when I was chief of history of SIS was mooted, I sort of anticipated the difficulty of producing something that would be consistent with the service's disclosure policies. And my preference would have been to have got a group of distinguished historians like yourself who had taken, a particular event or a particular series of things that happened in the service with access to the more interesting operational files, and then written a monograph about illustrative bits of the service's history, I think that would have been a much more exciting and better read. But
Because that's how the files are filed, aren't they? They're filed by case rather than by theme, as it were.
I mean, of course, with IT that begins to change, but because you can cross-reference your information in so many different ways. But I mean, the physical files are largely filed according to source identity and operation, and it makes it very difficult to look at big generic subjects if you're going back into the history of the service, and of course that determines one's attitude. I mean, I think Keith, within the limitations of the access he was given, wrote an interesting book, but it was a bit disappointing. I mean, for example, that the lady who was the Foreign Office historian, if you go back in time, was allowed access to the files on the Zinoviev letter, and she wrote a monograph on the Zinoviev letter. I'm trying to remember her name. It's a terrible failure on my part. Senior moment. But anyway, that's really interesting and very good, because it gives a sort of explanation of these extraordinary political events and the fact that the Zinoviev letter was in fact probably an operation.
Yes, I think you're right, and it's gosh, her name's on the tip of my tongue as well. Let's move on, and let me start a new idea. You mentioned the future of the West. Sorry, you mentioned the failure of the West in one of your earlier answers. Let's talk about some of the successes of the West, because there have been a lot, haven't there? One thinks of Penkovsky, one thinks of the Mitrokhin archive, obviously Oleg Gordievsky. These really do prove that the Harold Shergold more optimistic view of SIS was the correct one, rather than the counterintelligence nihilists, don't they?
I think that's absolutely the case, and I mean, we can only talk about the cases that are in the public domain, and strongly so. I mean, Penkovsky obviously being one of the most famous, and the Americans allowed a very informative book to be written about him. It's titled "The Spy Who Saved The Spy Who Saved the World," I think, and it's by Daniel Schechter. And it's a very thorough description of the case, and I think it was written because the Russians released an account from their archives, and the Americans really wanted their account to it describes the Anglo-British case. It's very complete. I mean, obviously, the Gordievsky case is now thoroughly in the public domain. And there's a book written about that, which is not an official book sanctioned by the service, but there's an awful lot of detail in it.
Is that Ben McIntyre's, the one by Ben? Yeah.
Which is based on interviews, and I mean, it pretty much accounts to almost a formal release of the case, because it's so detailed and very good, and a terrific read. Then, of course, the most extraordinary, perhaps of all, but it's very scholarly, is Christopher Andrews' books on the Mitrokhin archive. Just to remind people, Mitrokhin was KGB archivist who appeared in the West briefly in the Baltic states, claiming that he had buried under his dasher transcribed documents of all the material on many, many sensitive cases that he had seen as the archivist, indicating that he wanted to come to the West. I mean, I won't go into the detail. I mean, he tried to attract the attentions of the Americans and failed. Succeeded with the British. And eventually his family, well, his wife and son, who was handicapped in a wheelchair, were exfiltrated to the West, and including this trunk or several trunks of documents which had been hidden under his dasher in Moscow, and which he had accumulated over many years. And I mean, the Mitrokhin archive is probably the most revelatory archive that exists to this day of Cold War espionage, and a whole range of cases are described. I mean, successful KGB cases are described in detail. It's really it was an amazing intelligence coup, and it was a hugely successful operation. I mean, the decision was made to put all the material in the public domain. It took a long time for it to be transcribed because Mitrokhin's notes are a bit like Pepys's diaries. They're written in a type of code, but they had a group of people who worked on them for several years. And there were a huge number of global CI investigations that were created from the material. So it wasn't. And then there's another case, which I think is not publicly much talked about, but it's in the public domain, which extraordinarily was a French case. I'd say extraordinary because it was run by the French Security Service, not the French Intelligence Service. And the code name for that case is Farewell. It's the subject of a film in France, a very good movie, and it's also the subject of a very revelatory book. And Farewell was in the S&T, the Science and Technology part of the KGB, and went back to a central job in Moscow, and in that job gave the West massive amounts of documentation which had never really been seen before. And probably in terms of value in the Cold War and understanding armament systems and where the Russians had got to in the development of various armaments, the Farewell case probably is almost more important than the Penkovsky case.
Would you just like to remind listeners about Penkovsky?
Penkovsky was a general in the Russian general staff, and recently is the subject of a film which surrounds the character of a man called Greville Wynne. I mean, Penkovsky approached Greville Wynne, who was a contact, an official contact of his, and indicated he wanted to spy for the West. Greville Wynne became the sort of courier for the case. And over time, I mean, Penkovsky gave the West, and the case was run jointly by British and American services, a massive amount of material which was crucial to understanding Soviet rocket nuclear capabilities. And the reason that Kennedy was able to take a stand on Cuba over the whole issue of the Cuba crisis in the early 1960s was because of Penkovsky's intelligence, which was so detailed and so extensive. I mean, eventually Penkovsky, who was run in Moscow and actually met by the famously met, and this is all recorded in the book, by the wife of one of the British station officers under deep cover in Moscow, but it was the wife that met him with the baby, and he dropped his microfilm photograph into the pram. Anyway, it's all in the book, and it's an extraordinary story. I mean, eventually Penkovsky was caught and shot because I think the leak was so extensive the Russians realized they had a serious problem. Much later in the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, Penkovsky's the remains of his family, as it were, came out to the West and were resettled.
You mentioned it was a joint British-American operation. You spent some time in Washington, didn't you? As was it head of station of SIS in Washington? Are the assumptions that we all make about the close working relationship between the CIA and MI6 accurate?
Well, that's a very specific question, and I must be careful how I answer it.
It's true of all of my questions, Richard.
The special relationship well, it was then, and I think it still is, in very good shape. What I mean by that is that at the core of what's called Five Eyes, which is the Anglophone or the Anglosphere Intelligence Alliance, which is United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. I mean, at the core of that, the sort of keystone of the architecture is the relationship between the UK and the US, and the primary example of that is what's called the UCUSA Agreement, which was signed in 1947, which is a treaty which specifically relates to the cooperation between NSA, that's the Intercept Service of American Intelligence, and our own GCHQ. That's not replicated in other areas, but it's representative of the ability of the two services to work together closely. But I mean, I would say that, the UK is a sovereign nation with its independent service, the Americans as a sovereign nation. And don't assume that, in all areas, this integration exists in the way that is expressed by, let's say, knowledge of what happened in the Penkovsky case. So there's not a sort of clear-cut and straightforward topic. It's quite nuanced.
Do you think that the Official Secrets Act is fit for purpose still in this age? It was passed, of course, in 1911, but in this age of the internet and so on, does it still hold good in your view?
No, it certainly needs updating. And my understanding is that this is under discussion with the current government. I mean, it doesn't account for, let's say, disclosure. And it's very easy, as you know, to put stuff on the internet and have it read instantly by millions of people. So it needs, as it were, adapting for the technology, just like intercept legislation, which is now an act, which is the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, has been massively updated and changed to take account of modern communications. The Official Secrets Act should also have been adapted, and I think it will be. It's complicated politically, and of course it's politically a bit of a hot potato. And it's not the thing that political parties grasp with enthusiasm because it's so difficult to do. But it will be updated, and it will take account, I think, of the problems of disclosure as opposed to the problems of working, being a traitor, a spy, and working for the Russians. And I think what would be the main characteristic of the changes of the penalties for disclosure will be much higher than they are hitherto. At the moment, I think under the current laws, the highest penalty for disclosure is 2 years.
That's ridiculous. It should be far, far.
It's ridiculous. I mean, I may be slightly wrong on that, but it certainly was. It's because there are some wonderfully famous modern cases of disclosure. The Tomlinson case, if you can recall that.
I remember I was at Cambridge with Tomlinson. He was in my college, the year above me, in fact, so I knew him.
Well, I mean, Tomlinson was, as you know, guilty of disclosure, was prosecuted and was locked up for 2 years, but he should have gone to prison for much, much longer than that.
I thought he skipped to France and got away with that.
When he was on bail, he did skip to France, yeah, you're absolutely right. But he had been released on bail, but he was still on, I think it was a shortened sentence, and he did a runner to France, yeah.
Talking about the future, you have stated that you didn't think that Brexit was threatened by, or at least Britain post-Brexit would be threatened in an intelligence sense, that the security in the Secret Intelligence Service was going to be able to deal with Brexit in its own way, and that it certainly wasn't a reason to vote Remain. Do you think that subsequent events have proved you right over this?
Triply right. Given what happened with Ukraine. I mean, I think what people have to understand is that the UK had always been opposed to the Commission accumulating any powers that related to national security. And if you go back to the idea of the European Constitution, which of course was not adopted, there were references in the original document to certain competencies on the part of the Commission for National Security issues. I mean, at the time, the UK made sure that all of these were extracted from the Constitution document, the one that was not agreed at Lisbon. But I mean, it's indicative of the attitude that we always had, and we were very unenthusiastic at Brussels in anything that touched on defence policy, frankly, and national security policy. And we were largely successful in holding the line. And I think what you have to understand then and now is that the UK is Europe's leading intelligence and security power. And of course, we also are one of Europe's leading defence powers. And I think you just have to see what's happened in Ukraine and the way that we've been able, as it were, to lead on support for the Ukrainians. And I mean, I'm sure that covers not just defence and arming them. It relates also to help with intelligence. And I'm sure that we've played, I mean, I haven't any details, I'm just speculating, we would have played an extremely important role. And I think, the fact that we're not constrained by European community membership, by common foreign and defence policy, which the EU tries to promote, has made a huge difference because we have much more flexibility. And, look at the response that we've had amongst those, who are keen to support Ukraine. It's put us in a leading and powerful position. I mean, I think when the Brexit debate was sort of hot, I was very critical of Cameron and Osborne on this issue because I don't think they really understood it. And they certainly didn't have any first-hand experience. And, if they'd come and asked me and sat down with me, I could have explained to them why they'd got this wrong. And I think I can say absolutely clearly and authoritatively now that on this issue, there's no question that I was right.
And do you think that the ferocity of the Russian attack and the illegality of it, obviously, might mean that somewhere in Moscow, as we speak, there might be somebody who is in the defense or intelligence services of Russia that might be helping us?
Well, let's put it like this. I would imagine amongst the Russian elite, Putin's intervention in Ukraine is highly controversial, despite the fact that we're not aware of the opposition and the criticism. There will be some very, very disillusioned Russians. For example, we know that one of the senior diplomats in Geneva recently defected because he was totally critical of Putin's policy over Ukraine and the way that the Russians had acted. There will be, for sure, Russians who will be offering their services to the Americans or to other Western nations because they so fundamentally disagree with Russian policy. I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, there were always ideological agents during the Cold War, and then if you look at Penkovsky, Gordievsky, the ones that we know about, okay, they had personal motivations, but they were also ideologically driven. And there will certainly be Russians now who have that attitude, and I hope that Western intelligence is making hay whilst the sun shines. That's perhaps not a very good saying, but
I've got two more questions, which I always ask every one of my guests. But before I do, I think the name of the lady who wrote that excellent piece on the Zinoviev letter was Jill
Jill
Bennett.
Bennett. And I really feel upset that I couldn't remember Jill's name.
No,
I
not at all.
apologize
No,
to her if she's listening to this podcast.
she's a very fine historian.
She's indeed.
What book are you reading at the moment?
I'm reading Peter Stoddart's The Last Assassin, which is described as a hunt for the killers of Julius Caesar. Now, I love Peter Stoddart's rather unusual books. I mean, he writes brilliantly, I think. And I like his style, his rather elliptical style, and he writes very poetically. But it's an extraordinary book. because it's both a political thriller, but it's much more profound than that, because it's a sort of clash between. I mean, I'm not originalist, but it is a clash. It describes a clash between idealism and tyranny. And I had no concept. I mean, I'm not a classical historian, but the chaos that followed Caesar's assassination and the sort of description of the brittleness of power structures where there's no organized succession and the chaos that followed. And of course, I think you read a book like this and immediately Putin's position in Russia springs to mind, and you wonder what on earth is going on around him, because for sure there is massive tension around the Kremlin at the moment. Okay, historically, there's never been a coup in Russia. There have been revolutions, there haven't been coups. But
Oh, hang on. I suppose the overthrow of Alexander the First, sorry, the overthrow that brought Alexander the First, where he sort of was involved in a palace coup
yeah,
that
I
killed his own
suppose
father, could have
I
been
always
called.
think that the sort of complex history of the removal of czars and their replacements don't really count as coups.
All right, okay, I'll give you that. You're the expert on coups, not me. I agree with you about Peter's book. It's fantastic. It takes you from the Ides of March up to the point where Octavian, later Augustus, kills every last one of the assassins of his great uncle. So it really is as you say, it's a thriller, but a proper history book as well. I really enjoyed that book.
It's a
Yeah.
brilliant history book. I mean, the research, and I think the juxtaposition of the civilization of the Roman Empire and its sheer brutality. I mean, I find that, and actually, once again, that makes me think of Russia. I'm a great admirer of Russian. I love Russian music. I love Russian literature. I'm not a Russian specialist, but there are aspects of life in Russia, particularly if you've been there and seen it, which are absolutely amazing. But then this stunning brutality that Russia can exercise even now in current times. And you find that juxtaposition in this book as well.
And my last question is about your historical counterfactual, your what if. What's the one that intrigues
Well,
you?
I just was honoured to unveil a monument at a place called Farm Hall, which is this extraordinary restored Georgian house outside Manchester, which is a village near Huntingdon. And this was one of the houses requisitioned in World War II by SOE, and it was used as a training place for agents, some quite famous ones who were parachuted into occupied Europe and played an important role in the intelligence war. But more appropriately for this question, it was also the house in which the 10 captured German nuclear scientists were incarcerated, I mean, in some luxury, for about 7 months at the end of World War II. And the whole house was bugged. And the idea was for the Allies to try to understand how close the Germans had got to creating an atom bomb. And it was the sort of conversation and the juxtaposition of these scientists, as they lived together. And it's an extraordinary story, and of course is the subject of a famous play by Michael Frayn, which was very good, called Copenhagen, or an earlier aspect of this issue, this problem. So I suppose my counterfactual is: suppose Hitler had followed the advice of some of these scientists and created an atom bomb, rather than putting all his effort scientifically into the development of the V2 rocket. Had he, let's say, in 1944, and things were going badly, had been able to drop an atom bomb in London, on London, which, it is not quite as fanciful as it sounds, given what we know historically, this would have probably ended World War II rather summarily. in
Yes.
Europe.
Yes, Operation Epsilon it was called, wasn't it?
It was called Epsilon.
At Hall, and I thought it was fascinating. I remember studying this some time ago. That when the German scientists, and you had Walter Heisenberg and lots of top ones there, when they were told about Hiroshima, they were all totally surprised and sort of shocked by it. But that's a fascinating what if. What if instead of them being surprised and shocked, they had actually cracked the method of enriching uranium to the point that they would be able to take out London. On
Because
that, sorry,
Hahn, who was amongst them,
yes, Otto Hahn was there.
Otto Hahn was there, and whilst he was there, he was awarded the Nobel Prize because of his discovery of nuclear fusion in 1939. And that's the sort of basis of the British atomic energy program. So, I mean, in some respects, some of them got very close, but they weren't sure, or they claimed they weren't sure. I mean, I don't think anyone's quite sure. I mean, Heisenberg sort of absolves himself historically in the transcripts.
Well, they didn't. They didn't know they were being bugged. They thought it was impossible to be bugged, didn't they?
Yeah,
They actually talk about whether or not
they
they are
talk
being
about.
bugged, and
They
then
say,
they
oh,
agree that it would be
they do
impossible to
that
do.
sort of thing. They won't be able to understand science anyway.
Well, thank you. Well, on that apocalyptic note of London being destroyed in the Blitz completely, Sir Richard Dearlove, thank you very much indeed for being my guest on Secrets of Statecraft.
Andrew, great fun, and I really enjoyed the discussion. I hope lots of people listen to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Join me on the next Secrets of Statecraft, when our guest will be Ayaan Hirsi Ali, one of the world's strongest voices on women's rights in the Islamic world.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society and improve the human condition. For more information about our work, or to listen to more of our podcasts, or watch our videos, please visit hoover.org.